Okay, dear all, I think we can start. My name is Serhiy Kiyashko. I work at National Bank of Ukraine and also Kiev School of Economics. And I'm going to moderate today's lecture. I welcome everyone and special welcome and many thanks to Barт Hobein, who kindly agreed to give a talk today. So what's going on today? We have the third online lecture for students. National Bank of Ukraine every year organizes a big annual research conference on monetary policy and related topics. And every year we also have such lectures for students. Unfortunately, due to the COVID pandemic, this year we have lectures in online format, but maybe it's also good because at least we have many people who could join us during these events. For example, in this lectorium, 76 universities from 25 cities in Ukraine registered and participate. And yesterday and 2 days ago, we had hundreds of participants, which is very good. A couple of words about bonuses. If you attend all 3 lectures, you are going to get a certificate of attendance. Then in the end of each lecture, we will have Q&A session, and 3 best questions will get some prizes from National Bank of Ukraine. And also we encourage you to share your experience in Facebook. Please use hashtag NBU Lectorium 2020. And the authors of 5, the most popular posts, will get some prizes from National Bank of Ukraine as well. Couple of words about rules. So all attendees will have their video camera off and mics muted. The only way for you to ask questions is to use the Q&A button, which you can find in the bottom part of your Zoom panel. You can ask questions both in English and Ukrainian. Please ask whatever you want, basically, but ideally something close to the lecture. Given our experience from 2 last lectures, we do not have time to ask all the questions. We will choose maybe 7 or 6 or 8 questions. I will have a right to choose the questions which I find the most appropriate. And then Bart will choose 3 best questions in the very end. So going to our lecture today, we are very thankful to Professor Barт Hobein from Arizona State University for agreeing to participate in this online lecture. Bart will present his results on the research regarding labor market. And the topic of the online lecture today is wage fluctuations over the business cycle. Bart?
Yeah.
The floor is yours. Please share your screen and you can start.
Thank you, Serhiy, and thank you for having me. What I'm going to present today is actually a little bit of research and a little bit of policy work related to stuff that I've done when I was at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco before I came to ASU in 2015, and as well as afterwards. This is an update of a speech I gave at the ECB in 2018, and it's about wage growth not only in the United States, but also in other countries. So let me do this. So here's the slides that this is the presentation. So what I'm going to do is, this is about wage growth over the business cycle, but really what it is showing you how we as macroeconomists have had a hard time understanding the developments of wage growth. And I'm talking here about nominal wage growth. So it's wage growth in currency, not in units of consumption, not corrected or deflated by prices. So nominal wage growth puzzles on both sides of the Atlantic. And we really, one of the perennial puzzles of macroeconomics is how wages move with the economy. When the economy is strong, you would think wages go up, both especially real wages, because the demand for workers is high and supply of workers is relatively fixed. And so you would have an outward shift in the demand curve and a relatively fixed supply curve. So you would assume that wages would go up. But wages are, and then in a downturn, you would expect wages to go down a lot. But that simply doesn't happen in most countries in the world. Now, wages going down is harder because there are issues with it's really hard to cut wages across countries. So I'll show you some evidence on that for both the United States and for countries in the Euro area as well as the European Union. And when I made this presentation first, the UK was still part of the European Union, but now I just have to say the Euro area, the European Union, and the UK. So for both for academic purposes, if you want to understand wage growth, how it moves over the business cycle, but also for policymakers, there were really two puzzles, two conundrums in the U.S. And those were all before we were going through the current crisis. So the first one was that in the Great Recession from 2008 to 2010, we actually didn't see much of a decline in wages. Wages were still growing relatively fast, given how high the unemployment rate was. And since then, in the expansion after the Great Recession, we saw very little acceleration when the labor market recovered. So we didn't see much fast wage growth. Now, in the US, as well as in some parts of the Euro area, like Germany, unemployment reached record low levels, but wage growth didn't go up that much. Now, in recent weeks, we were actually seeing some weird, strange things about wage growth. So I want to talk a little bit about what wage growth is probably going to do going forward, because we're going to see a real break of the relationship between wage growth and the unemployment rate going forward. So here's the measures of wage growth in the U.S. There's four main measures people look at. There's something called the first one in the legend is CPH, which is compensation per hour. This is taken from the National Income and Product Account. It's literally just adding up all the types of compensation people get: benefits, wages, salaries, so medical care benefits, and so these things. So this is basically all the employer payments to employees are then divided by the estimate of total number of hours. Now this is plotting a growth rate actually over a year, so it's a yearly growth rate. And what you see is in the 80s, wage growth was pretty high, and that was also because inflation was really high. So this was largely driven by inflation. But since the middle of the 80s, US inflation has hovered around 2%. And the rest of the movements in this time series are really just movements in real wage growth mainly. And as you can see, the red line spikes a lot. Here's a big spike, for example, compensation per hour. This was because people anticipated a big tax increase in 2000, I think 2013, if I remember correctly, and they moved bonus payments forward in the US. A large part of these big fluctuations in compensation per hour in the United States are actually related to bonus payments, especially in finance as well as in tech. So they affect rich people a lot, but and then there's average hourly earnings, which is for production and non-supervisory and production workers. And this is the yellow line. And you see it has kind of the same pattern, but they're not exactly the same. But the main pattern of wage growth is pretty much the same across the four measures. There's something called the employment cost index that measures really all the costs to the employers. This is used a lot. So it's very inclusive of everything. It's used by many corporations as well as the government for wage indexation purposes, for wage escalation purposes. And then there's median weekly earnings, which is the green line. That is what people self-report in the labor force survey as their wages. So it's self-reported earnings. Now, the blue line here is the average, and I'm looking at the average. In the last observation here, we only have average hourly earnings yet because the other data come in with a delay. You see this big spike that we're seeing here. And that has to do with the outbreak of the COVID recession. So I'll talk about that at the end and give you some sense of what's going on there. But you see, it's a really big outlier. So if I plot a wage growth versus the unemployment rate, then a couple of things to kind of put those facts, that conundrum that I spoke about in the first slide, in perspective. I plot wage growth, which is the blue line here on the left. This is a long historical time series. So you see this run up in the 60s and 70s, which is largely just partly a strong economy in the late 60s, and then it's largely the great inflation that a lot of industrialized countries went through in the 1970s. Inflation went down as a result, wage growth went down in the 80s, and then here's kind of the real wage growth in the US since. Of course, it's all corrected by 2%, 2% inflation. You have to deduct to get real wage growth, phenomenal wage growth. Now, the point I wanted to make about this slide is that when we saw the unemployment rate go up, we saw a little bit of a drop in wage growth, but not much. And then wage growth hovered around in the recovery from the Great Recession. While the unemployment rate is going down, wage growth hovered at around 2% a year. Now, we had a little bit lower than 2% inflation, but not much. So the actual purchasing power of the wages that people were making in the US didn't go up very much. And we didn't see big increases in that sense in standard of living in terms of labor income. We saw big increases in wealth income, but that obviously adds to inequality because that's very unequally distributed. And then, of course, the last observation here is that unemployment has gone up. You can't see that, but unemployment now in the United States is at a record 14%. But wage growth also went up to about 10%. To about 7%. So we are this weird world. So to put this all in perspective, let's go back to kind of an old paper by Phillips and look at this as a scatter plot. So Phillips in 1958 documented what we now know as the Phillips curve. But the Phillips curve is a relationship between output and inflation, and a lot of central banks use this as a framework for monetary policy analysis. But the original Phillips paper in 1958 was not about output and inflation. That's actually an interpretation that Samuelson and Solo gave to the results in the Phillips paper. The original Phillips paper was for the United Kingdom and documented using historical macroeconomic data a negative relationship between nominal wage growth and the unemployment rate. And that's the type of relationship we've actually seen in the US over the last decades. So this was before the Great Recession. We basically saw this negative, the blue dots are, we saw this negative relationship. Some periods had higher wage growth with a higher unemployment rate. These were periods where generally productivity growth was faster, and we'll talk about that later. But generally there's a negative relationship like this. And this is true in many countries. Jordi Gali, who will be presenting at this conference, for those of you who have the pleasure of attending that on Zoom as well. Jordi is a former professor of mine, and he's, of course, a world-famous researcher. He's done a lot of research on kind of the shape of the wage Phillips curve in the US and other countries. Now, but what you see is that since the Great Recession, if you would have extrapolated this, you would have had wage growth in the Great Recession that would be largely negative. That never happened. What happened instead was wage growth in the US became close to 2%, but not much below 2%. And then during the recovery, what happened was wage growth went here, and then during the recovery, it never went up to the same level it was before. We were basically having a big gap in wage growth in the United States. Now, the United States is no exception. This is true for many industrialized countries, and I'll show you some evidence for Euro area countries and the UK later on in this lecture. So one of the puzzles we were facing in the Great Recession is, why aren't wages declining when we are in the deepest post-war recession? Now, that's not the deepest post-war recession anymore. That's now the COVID recession. But that was a real puzzle. And it was true in many countries. What I'm showing you for the US is not an exception. So we had this unprecedented low wage growth during the expansion for the level of the unemployment rate we saw. And that was, for example, the same in Germany. Now, in the wake of COVID-19, look at what I did. I plotted the same data here, but I just had to change the scale, because now all of a sudden the highest unemployment rate we've seen in the US is 14.5%, right here. And at that unemployment rate, we're now having 7% wage growth. So look how this is just an enormous outlier. That also means that if we want to understand what's going on with wages, and presumably also to some extent with inflation, to the extent that wages feed through into inflation. Now that pass-through from wages to inflation is very imperfect in almost all countries. And one of the papers on the programs by Ayşegül Şahin and co-authors addresses this question. But what you really see is that this is just a total outlier in this negative relationship between the unemployment rate and wage growth. And so the wage Phillips curve in this recession is really totally falling apart. And so the question then is why? And we have a good understanding why. So hopefully by the end of this lecture, you also have a better understanding of why that is. Now, the next thing, just to emphasize this, is that we saw also slow wage growth in euro area countries. So if we look at Germany had a record. This is the red dashed line here. This is wage growth in Germany. This is wage growth in the euro area. Of course, in the euro area, time series don't go back that far. But what you're really seeing is, and the other difference between the euro area and the United States, is that the euro area had two recessions in the before the COVID recession from 2008, and then the 2011 recession that was associated with the euro, the crisis of the euro, and the sovereign debt crisis in Greece and other countries in the euro area. Something, by the way, that's still a concern. But what you really see is that in many euro area countries, wages really didn't decline very much. In fact, in the Netherlands, where I'm originally from, wages actually went up during the recession, wage growth, and then there was a decline afterwards. And then wage growth ticked up a little when the economy recovered. And the Netherlands, right before this, in early this year, had a really low unemployment rate, but not much wage growth going on. So in many countries, the same conundrum that you had, you saw a wage growth increases, or at least no big declines in the recession, or in the Great Recession here for the Netherlands, and then in the Euro crisis. And you didn't see very much of an acceleration of wage growth and unemployment rates decline. It's very similar across countries. Here are the unemployment rates, just to show that the Netherlands and Germany had record low unemployment rates, but didn't have very high wage growth right before this COVID recession hit. So the points of this presentation are as follows, based on this data, is that, why was wage growth not high? Well, maybe the unemployment rate was not measuring the amount of unused labor, which we call resource slack or labor market slack. So that there was still more slack in the labor market than we were measuring through the unemployment rate before the COVID recession broke out. So a point many people have made is that unemployment rates understate the slack in the labor market. Think of it as, so many people might have been working part-time when they wanted to work full-time. Other people decided to give up looking for work after the Great Recession, and they sat on the sideline of the labor market, and they weren't finding any jobs. Now, I'll show you there's a little evidence that right in the early parts of this year, there was much of that going on, but for a while, wage growth in the wake of the Great Recession was slow because of that potential. And so the biggest concern was that we saw very big movements along the participation margin in the wake of the Great Recession, and that we don't really think of the participation margin as a particular way of thinking about slack, but that has actually been important. And the academic literature on the labor market has often ignored the importance of the participation margin for business cycle fluctuations in the labor market. In many models, some of you might have seen the Diamond, Mortenson, Pissarides model, which is the search model for which Diamond, Mortenson, and Pissarides got Mortenson and Pissarides wrote together a paper in 1994, and then Peter Diamond wrote search models before that. They jointly won the Nobel Prize for that. But that model, the MP model, doesn't really have any labor participation margins, just assuming that participation is fixed. But we're seeing substantial movements. And we also think that that might change going forward. We might see more movements, and better understanding participation is thus important. And then the other thing that's a bigger concern is that we're basically seeing a decline in the trend growth rate, the engine, the long run growth engine that's driving most of wage growth. Now, if you would use something like a solo model, almost any model with a balanced growth path will have wage growth along that balanced growth path go at the same rate as what's labor augmenting technological progress. And so think of it as productivity growth. And so one of the concerns is that we're just seeing low productivity growth, and that's one of the symptoms of low productivity growth in many countries is actually low wage growth. And as you'll see, that is actually something that's borne out in the data. A large part of the slowdown in wage growth across many countries seems to be due to slow productivity growth. And I'll show you some evidence on that. Now, the other thing that is important is that now that we're in the deepest, really by far the deepest recession we've ever been in the post-war period, and think of it as the first recession of the size of the Great Depression since we're really keeping reliable national statistics, and we don't kind of have to backcast them for many countries. What we're seeing is we're seeing a weird thing that I showed you already. Wage growth is actually going up rather than going down, even though the labor market is weakening. And this is due to the composition effect. What's happening, and I shall show you, is what's happening is that we're basically eliminating jobs for low wage workers. So the average earnings go up because the low jobs of low wage workers are disappearing disproportionately. And so the average payment per worker, what the average worker earns per hours, is just going up because the composition of who's working is changing over time. Now, composition effects in the labor market are well known. There's a lot of literature. There's a big literature on it. The paper that I'm presenting tomorrow is also related to that. But it's really, really important now. So the way you want to think about wage growth is really an escalator. What happens to wages in the labor market is people jump on an escalator and they keep on going up. And so you want to think about the rate at which wages go up for the people who are on this escalator, who are continuously employed, but also you want to think about where people enter the escalator relative to where the people are that are employed, and potentially where they exit the escalator as well. Now, the first thing to realize is that in almost all countries, this escalator operates mainly in one direction. There's very few people who've had wage cuts in their life on nominal wages. There are some cases in which that happens. There are some countries in which they're more common than others, but there's extensive work. I think the nicest work is a Journal of Economic Perspectives paper by Bill Dickens and many other co-authors, where they looked at underlying microdata from many European countries and the US, as well as I think Canada and Australia and New Zealand. And what they find is that very few workers get wage cuts, and in some countries, very few workers even get real wage cuts. So their wages always go up at the inflation rate or higher. I'm not saying this is desirable, but this is a reality of how the labor market works in many countries. In the US, we can measure this as kind of by through the fraction of workers who report to be in the same job as a year ago. And in some periods, we can't identify them in the data that we were using, which is the current population survey. This is released monthly by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. It's based on research that Mary Daly, who's the president of the San Francisco Fed now, and I did a while ago, and it's still being updated. And what you see is that these are the fraction of workers who report to have the same wage, and they report to be in the same job and have the same wage as a year ago. And that fraction tends to go up starting a little bit after the beginning of the recession. And then it goes down during labor market expansions, and then it goes up. Now, what's remarkable here is that this fraction has actually never come down to the level it was before during the expansion after the Great Recession, even though the US had a record low unemployment rate. And there's a few reasons for this. There's a literature on this called downward nominal wage rigidities. And it's determined by two things. By kind of think of it as the trend rate at which wages go up. So productivity growth plus inflation, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But productivity growth was low and inflation was low in this period. So a lot of these people were just bumping into the fact that they were basically getting a wage decline that would be bigger than the trend growth will be, and but the wage decline didn't happen, so they were bumping into zero. So this means that the fact that we have low inflation and low productivity growth is actually making downward nominal wage rigidities more binding in the labor market in the US now. And I haven't seen this microdata for other countries, but I would presume you'd see the same thing in Euro area countries and the UK as well. So that was indicative. This is still elevated level of people who are not getting wage increases was still indicative of there being substantial slack in the labor market even in 2019. Although comparing this over time, obviously, is influenced by productivity and inflation trends. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is that this is evidence, together with some evidence on participation that I'll show you in a minute, that there was still substantial unused resources in the labor market in the United States. But the flip side of this was, how do we really figure out how strong the labor market is? In a really strong labor market, poaching increases. Employers hire workers from other employers, and there's extensive literature on this now by Moscarini and oh, I forget his name. It's Giuseppe Moscarini and Postalvine have a whole bunch of papers on this, where they have a labor market with job ladders. And so workers get increasingly poached from smaller firms to large firms when the economy improves. And so they will quit and take another better job. On top of that, when the economy improves, people who are on the sideline of the labor market, they will actually start re-entering again and take jobs and start earning a wage. So those two things, if we see more people quit and if we see people re-enter the labor market, that's a sense of a really strong labor market. The re-entry is really the last thing you see, but we saw a lot of that in the US and actually to some extent also in some countries in Northern Europe before the COVID recession broke out in 2018 and 2019. So let's start with participation first. This is the labor force participation rate in the United States. It's the fraction of people it's a fraction of the civilian non-institutionalized population who either work or who are looking for work. So think of this as the labor supply as a fraction of the population. So it's closely related to what some people at the Eurostat call the activity rate. But and what you see, the labor force participation rate in the US started increasing in the 60s. This coincides basically with, it's largely driven, let's say it this way, by women entering the labor force. And that process went on till the late 1990s. And then there were two things going on. Women stopped entering the labor force because it's not full equalization of participation rates between men and women in the US, but it's very close. And then, of course, we had baby boomers that were born at the beginning of this part, so in the 1940s, were now starting to retire. And so slowly but surely, there was downward pressure on the participation rate. Now, this downward pressure was accelerated because in the United States, we've also seen participation rates drop precipitously for low educated men and women, especially men. And in some areas, there's some evidence that this has to do with the drug epidemic due to the opioid crisis that accelerated that from the beginning of the 2000s. So there's Angus Deaton and Ann Case have a Brookings study that talks about the deaths of despair in the United States, but it largely is reflected in aggregate labor market statistics as people dropping out of the labor force, not working anymore in certain particular demographic groups and in certain particular areas. So this downward trend is aging plus a few other effects. And then that downward trend, as you can see, accelerated in the Great Recession. And then it's kind of reversed itself a little And this is really reflecting, I think the interpretation for most people, this is largely reflecting some cyclical movement in the participation rate, where there was a steep drop and a kind of an increase. And if in the absence of the Great Recession, we would have probably seen a decline more like this. So that's a pretty big movement if you think about it that way. You would see it's about a 1.5 percentage point movement in the participation rate, because the denominator is different. That 1.5 percentage point would be about 2.25 percentage point on the unemployment rate. So that was one of the reasons there was belief that there was still substantial resource labor slack in the labor market that might have contributed to wages not going up that much. Yes, we didn't count them as unemployed, but these were people who potentially could work and would work as long as wages would increase and the labor market would improve. Now, at the end of this sample, around this period, the labor market in the US was especially strong for low-wage workers. So part of the wage increases that we saw at the end of this was actually at the lower end of the income distribution. There's a real sense of that the tide was rising faster for low-wage workers. Of course, they were still in a lower wave, but the wave was growing faster. And for people who were concerned or are concerned about inequality, that was a good sign. But of course, that was abruptly stopped by the outbreak of the COVID pandemic. Now, in the euro area, participation is not so clearly cyclical, and there's a little bit of an analysis of whether participation was cyclical or not, but that was mainly studied for the US, not as much for the euro area. So I'm not that much familiar with many studies who did this. So that's still an open question, but I think, as I'll show you in a minute, as I showed you this deep drop in participation. As I showed you this deep drop in participation in the US in the COVID recession, you're going to have the same question for many European countries. Now, partly this drop in participation in the US is reflective of the US not providing as many wage subsidies as European countries. So in many countries, people who are out of the labor force in the US will be counted as employed because the government is still subsidizing their wages. But still, once we go through the recovery, we might see people drop off payroll, and we might see people drop out of the labor force. So the cyclical response of participation is still a big question. Anyway, the real point for the recovery after the Great Recession was, how much slack is there in the labor market still left? But if we actually look at what people were doing, is we were looking at people separating from their jobs. This is the separation rate measured by a survey in the United States called JOLTS, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. It's monthly, every month, which is really a large number if you think about it. 4% of workers in the United States who are in payroll actually leave that job. Now, there's a few destinations where they can go to. They can basically retire, or you have basically voluntary and involuntary retirement. That's in the yellow line. And involuntary environment and retirement would be a death, basically. But that's a really small fraction. The biggest fraction, and the fractions that people focus on, are layoffs and quits. The green part is quits, and the red part is layoffs. Now you see layoffs started going up at the beginning of the Great Recession and really spiked in 2009, early 2009. But what I wanted to really focus on is look at the fraction of people who were quitting as a percent of the employed. That fraction was almost 2% every month. It reached a record high. That's known as the quits rate in the wake right before the COVID crisis broke out, and really indicating the labor market was very strong. People who had jobs found very good job opportunities and were leaving for better jobs at a record rate. And 2% is really high. So if you look for this in Euro area countries, they don't have the same type of surveys in most countries, the labor JOLT survey, but other evidence of job-to-job switches and stuff suggests that that's much lower in most European countries than it's in the United States. Now, I also want to say that these types of quits are in the US are very much low among young people early career people as well as low skilled workers who do a lot of job hopping. So there's, don't think that there's someone who's higher educated with a college degree and a secure job does a lot of quitting, but it's still going on, and it increases when the labor market's strong. So those are indications that this is an indication that, hey, we saw relatively low wage growth, so a little bit of an acceleration of it, but we still saw relatively low wage growth even in 2018 and 19, in spite of the fact that there was actually very little slack in the labor market. Now, of course, what stands out, the final thing what stands out is this enormous spike here, which is in separations, which is almost all layoffs. And so you see again where the COVID recession is just showing up as a total deviation from previous historical patterns in the labor market. Now, this unmeasured slack, which was on wage growth, which if I kind of roughly draw this, I didn't do any formal econometric analysis, but if I would have expanded this line, I would have ended up here. This line's approximately here. So you're talking about 1 3/4 to 2 percentage points of missing wage growth. You have to ask yourself, why is this then? Why did that happen? And the real concern is that we saw a deceleration of trend wage growth in the United States, as well as in other countries. And so to think through this, you have to really think about what determines people's wages. And basically what happens is people think of a world in which people bake pies in a bakery. Then what determines their wages? First of all is the price at which the pies are being sold. That's called inflation. If the value in terms of if the money value of what you produce goes up, your wages tend to go up as well in money. If you bake more pies, your wages will go up to reflect the fact that you're more productive. So that's another determinant of how quickly wages grow. If you get a bigger share of the pie, known as the labor share, the total share of output that's paid to, or the income related to output that's paid to workers, if that goes up, then wages also grow. So those are the three main determinants of wage growth: inflation, productivity, growth, and the labor share. That's an identity, basically. To think about it this way and to understand that identity, let's look at a little bit of math. For those of you who are math geeks, here you have an equation. I haven't shown any of them yet. So this is nominal wage. This is the nominal wage paid to workers. This is basically saying that's the price of consumption goods times, but it's basically what I'm doing is I'm just dividing this thing by something and then multiplying it by the same thing. So it's the price of the consumption good, and then it's the price of the output that the worker produces divided by the price of the goods that workers buy. And that turns to be a big difference between the increase in these prices. Increase of consumer goods go up faster, consumer goods prices, than output prices. And this is because prices of investment goods, so think of it as capital equipment like computers and stuff, those prices have actually are not going up very fast, and some of these prices are declining. Then there's output per hour. That is literally productivity. How much do you produce per hour? This is all related to the inflation part that I showed you. And then the final thing is wages times hours, which is just total compensation paid. And this is the value of output. So this is the labor share. Now, in the US, all of this data, and it's hyperlinked if you get the slides, are basically produced in the productivity and cost release. So you don't have to read any academic papers to do this, but you can just download quarterly data from the BLS website. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at, I'm going to figure out how each of these components have contributed to wage growth in the US. So here's the inflation rate, and here's the relative price component. And especially in the 90s, that relative price component is negative because of computers improving in quality a lot, as reflected in the national account. There's a big discussion whether that's measured correctly or not, but let's leave that aside. And then there's the inflation part of it, which is the blue part. So inflation was really high in the 70s, contributing a lot to wage growth, nominal wage growth. But we've seen a deceleration in inflation in recent years. And even though the Federal Reserve has targeted a 2% inflation rate, we really haven't seen a 2% inflation rate in the US. We've seen an inflation rate that's been hovering more around 1.5 to 1.75%. Now, for many of you who've lived in countries like in the Ukraine, where the inflation rate fluctuates more than that, this is really enormous fine-tuning. But for U.S. nationals discussed economic discussions, these decelerations are discussed and they matter. But they're relatively small compared to inflation fluctuations in many other countries. Here's productivity growth in the US. Now, as you can see, one of the problems with output per hour in the US, which is the blue line, is it's very, very choppy. And these are pretty good US data is pretty good. I mean, there's reasons to criticize it, but it's pretty much on the frontier of doing national accounts. And as you can see, this is just a property of the economy. It's a ratio of two things: output moves, hours moves, not always through things that are related. And the ratio of the two things, if you look at the growth rate of that ratio, just is very volatile because of the volatility of the numerator and the denominator. So what people do is they take moving averages. This is the yellow line is the historical average, the yellow dashed line, and then the red line is the 10-year moving average. And what you're really seeing in the US is productivity growth was fast in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. Then there was a decline in the 70s and then early 80s. This 10-year moving average, so it trails a little. And then productivity growth accelerated again all the way through the 90s in the IT boom. And then we basically saw a decline in productivity growth. Now, this is a 10-year moving average. The real decline started 10 years before that in the early 2000s. But now productivity growth is substantially below its historical average. And that's going to affect wage growth because, remember, wage growth is driven partly by productivity growth. If you produce more pies, you're going to get paid more. So if you start producing, the rate at which you start producing more pies is declining, that causes a decline in wage growth. Now, this decline in wage growth, this pattern is actually common across many industrialized countries. A big productivity slowdown in the 70s, and what we now think is a substantial productivity slowdown since the beginning of the 2000s. Now, in emerging Asia, that did not happen. There was a productivity boom in the early 2000s, but even there, in China and in India, we've seen a productivity slowdown from the early 2010s onwards. And then here's the piece of the pie that workers get. They get around 2/3. That's just kind of the thing. So if you ever use a Cobb-Douglas production function in anything you do, a Cobb-Douglas production function, if you have flexible wages, basically implies that the labor share is going to be it's going to be equal to the the output elasticity of hours, and so that's going to be about 2/3. That's why they get 2/3, and they also would imply that this would be constant. Now, look, I'm plotting this from 66 to 56. If I plot between 0 and 100, it would look relatively constant still. But for historical standards, we've seen a couple of things in recent years. We've seen what's effectively starting a decline in the 80s. Then you see this big run up in the labor share. You see that? And then basically this decline continues. And then it kind of flattened out later on. This again, is flattening out, is what some people see as an indication of maybe even a recovery in the labor market. This decline in the labor share is common in many countries. This blip is not. This blip here is mostly bonuses paid in the banking sector, in real estate, and in IT, but mainly in the banking sector and IT. During the IT bubble of the late 1990s, you see a little bit of this blip here. And this is largely, not all of it, but it's largely bonuses paid in the banking sector and real estate during the housing bubble in the United States. So these things are things that show up in national statistics. And overall, though, we've seen a decline in the labor share. However, recently, the labor share has not been declining. So here, this would lower wages when the labor share is declining. It will lower wage growth, sorry. But here, we're not seeing any decline in wage growth in recent years due to changes in the labor share. So let's put this all together. In the US, wage growth has really declined from 4.25% from 1998 to 2007. And then from 2014 to 2019, it was 1 and 2.75 percentage points lower. And that largely is due to, and here I just decomposed them. Here's the difference. So some of that decline, so this 1.75 percentage point, some of that was due to inflation being lower. But most of this seems to have to do with productivity growth. There's a little bit of a relative price effect and a little bit of the labor share, but that's really not what it is. Really what's going on is we are just not getting better at what we're doing at the same rate we were before. Sorry, I'm drawing this as a smiley, but I meant this to be something not to be happy about. And this is actually true not only in the US, it's true in most other countries. So with this productivity slowdown of the early 2000s, we're now seeing that it has really dragged down the rate at which wages have been growing across over time. So if I put this in a diagram, here's basically what this is the difference between this line and this line. I've ignored the middle from 2008 to 2013 because this is largely affected by the Great Recession. So I'm looking at a strong labor market. There's a little recession here that didn't do much. So I'm looking at a very strong labor market from 2014 to 2019, and a period with a largely strong labor market from 1998 to 2007. And the difference is really all productivity growth. It's this green bar. Now, I can do something very similar to for the euro area. Here's some numbers just to prove to you that I calculated them. I think it's easier to look at the same bars for the euro area and the UK, and you get something very similar. If I decompose the wage deceleration in the euro area, what you're seeing is inflation seems to be a little bit more important in the euro area. There's a slowdown in inflation. Now, partly this is what the ECB probably would consider. I can talk on their behalf, but I think they would consider that a success story because they started the euro area in the early 2000s. They gained credibility, and inflation, therefore, got closer to 2%. However, the other parts, the green parts, are still really substantial, and you see them in many countries. You see wage growth being lower by a percentage point or more, especially in the Netherlands, Germany, and France, and in the UK. In those places, you really see wage growth being lower by a percentage point and more, simply because productivity growth has decelerated. And so that's really important in the sense that if we want to understand kind of where wages will go after the recession again, is we really want to understand what's slowing down trend growth in wages. But at the end, the puzzle then is what's slowing down growth in productivity and trend growth in output, and understanding that. For a central bank, that's important because that's determining the rate of potential output at which the economy grows, relative to which you could provide both fiscal or monetary stimulus. Now let's end this with a couple of minutes on the recession. In the recession, what we're seeing is disproportionate job losses and hours reduction among low-wage workers. And so what happens is we're measuring the average wage paid to everyone in the labor market. Now, if low-wage workers drop off, so think about it this way: the average wage among these two workers is somewhere this spot on the escalator. That would be your average wage here. Now, in the recession, this worker drops out. Now the average wage just goes up because this worker is the only one left, and this person on average is here on the escalator. So that's what the composition effect really is. That in a macro sense, what we're doing is we're summing over a whole bunch of people, but those people are not the same. So if the composition of these people, the composition of the labor force changes over the business cycle, that can really significantly impact movements in macroeconomic aggregates. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the low-wage workers dropping out of the labor market, and that's driving up measured wage growth to a level that's really almost looking like we have unprecedentedly high wage growth, but really we don't. So one of the lessons to take from this is you don't really want to look at these aggregates that take into account don't take into account people moving in and out of the labor market. You really want to use data on the wages of individual workers who are employed at the beginning and the year and the end of the year, and consider how quickly their wages grow. And this is what Mary Daly and I call the intensive margin of wage adjustment, for which we present some results in our paper now. That point hasn't been made before, although it's important to know how important these different components are, the composition effect, versus the other part for average wage growth, aggregate wage growth. Because in a period like this, when there are relative important shifts, you can get a very different signal about the strength of the labor market when you look at these aggregate measures than when you think you're getting. And that's really because you're not looking at the same labor market anymore. These are just different workers who are employed than they were before. And so let me end again with this wage Phillips curve plot, which means that because of this big composition effect, we're going to see a big disconnect between aggregate wage growth measures and labor market slack. And as a result, I wouldn't use wage growth measures, aggregate wage growth measures at least, as a good indicator of inflationary pressures or resource slack in the overall economy. And that ends my presentation. So here's the conclusions, but that's it.
Dear Bart, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. Now we have probably 10 or 12 minutes to ask some questions, and I remind our students that 3 best questions will be awarded afterwards. So let me start from the question by Andriy. Andriy asks, how strongly does the degree of openness of economy affect the cyclical nature of wages? Like openness of economy, is it important how it affects wages during business cycles?
So there's not an extensive literature on that. There's a little bit of a literature on it. A more open economy would probably see, but I don't know the exact academic results on this, but you would probably see more cyclicality of wages because overall, because terms of trade shocks will add to an amplifying effect to the business cycle and to labor demand across sectors. So you would get a stronger cyclicality of wages. But in many open economies, wages themselves are controlled. I mean, think about in Luxembourg, which is probably the most open economy in the world, where even half of the working population moves in and out of the country every day. Wages are negotiated, and so there's other factors that would prevent wages from adjusting. So think about that as institutional wage rigidities. But in principle, if 2 countries are identical, one's more open than the other, you would expect the open economy to have more cyclically sensitive labor demand, and as a result, for most business cycles, and as a result, you would expect wages to be more cyclical.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Let me ask a question by Yulia. She asks how to regulate wages and labor incentives in the context of the financial economic crisis. Like she asks how, and I can ask, should we regulate wages maybe during crisis?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about, I think to some extent, a lot of smart people have thought about this in the last month and have implemented policies. And there have been 2 approaches largely. One is to subsidize wages, which a lot of European countries have been doing. If you have a very temporary shock in the economy and then you expect almost a full recovery, and this is a totally exogenous shock, you don't want employment relationships to get lost and then have to be reestablished. That's very costly. So you keep people, you subsidize businesses to keep people on payroll in order to prevent that costly part to happen. And that's what's been happening in a lot of countries. In the US, this is done not through direct wage subsidies, but through loans to businesses to stay in business. If you keep people on payroll, the loans are forgiven. That's known as the PPP program for small businesses. In Europe, these are really wage subsidies. That makes sense to some extent. I think increasingly people who look at the COVID recession are thinking that we're not really going back to where we came from. Instead, we're going to have an economy that's going to change. People are not going to go that much to restaurants. People are going to be on Zoom more often, going to do stuff. There's a real more structural change in the economy. And wage subsidies and also wage rigidities would prevent these adjustments, this reallocation of labor, that would make workers less willing to move and affect their participation rate. On top of that, if you have generous unemployment benefits, which we really have in the US at the moment, they added $600 a week until the end of July. the people who get these very generous benefits would not be willing to take jobs in sectors that are actually growing for the moment. That would affect our labor supply. So this is not only about wages, it's also about benefits. Overall, it makes sense in the short run to provide income security for people and make sure that there's not a huge disruption in terms of employment relationships. In the medium run, though, we really need to think about whether those policies couldn't get in the way of adjustments we need in the economy in order to move to what we now, most economists think is a slightly different steady state than where we were before, at least for a while.
Okay, thank you very much. You talked about that we have lower participation of low-skilled workers. And Ostaps asks probably related question: what is the impact of increase in real wages on Gini index or inequality? And is there any positive correlation between increase in wages? Whether increase in wages can lead to higher inequality in society?
Yeah, so wage growth itself in aggregate statistics is not necessarily leading to more inequality. We've gone through periods with very strong wage growth in the post-war period, both in the US as well as in Europe and in Japan and in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. So where we didn't see an increase in inequality. It's not necessarily the case that wage growth will lead to direct increases in inequality. It's just that what we've seen in recent years, basically already since the 1980s, has been a trend towards increased inequality, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, but also in many other countries. Now, there are some countries where inequality hasn't increased notably. Sweden, the Netherlands is one, but in most countries it has.
Okay, thank you. One question, like people are worried about this COVID-19 crisis, and one question from Victor is about unconditional basic income. Bart, in your opinion, has the concept of unconditional basic income received additional arguments in its favor due to the coronavirus pandemic? And what do you think about it?
Yeah, so unconditional basic income is not something a lot of economists in the US would talk about, because they think about an efficient allocation of resources where these things are not really taken into account. But the real concern here is, and we're seeing that here, and you see that in the UK as well, in countries where there's a big left-hand tail in the income distribution, and these people are bearing the brunt of a deep recession like this, a lot of people will drop below this a basic income level. And so there is a discussion among some parts of the some politicians that you need to assure at least this basic income. So has it gotten more political support? I would say no, not here in the US. Is there evidence of how many people here live on that fringe and run the risk of falling way below that? Yeah, that's very clear now, and that's a real big concern, because with the depth of the recession as well as the expected length of it by now, we expect these people to be below that substantially. Now, current policies have people allowed to not pay their mortgages. Now, people who are running at the unconditional basic income level are basically living at that level, are mostly renters, but they can also postpone paying their rent for a while. So there are some policies that try to alleviate this, but I think fundamentally that is in the background, thinking about it, but not explicitly saying unconditional basic income. Does that make sense? And I think that is really a political decision, because saying that here in the United States is not a politically viable thing to do.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question concerning COVID-19. Vadim asks about digitalization of sectors of economy and how it can affect level of wages in the future. Like, given the restrictions from COVID, we have like more sectors become more digitalized. So can we have some new trends on labor market? What do you think?
The answer is yes. I think the real question here is what's going to happen in the medium run in the economy. Are some of the new normal things that we're learning we can do just changing people's behavior permanently. Think of it as a business trip. I mean, I would be in Ukraine right now. I'm not, but I can also teach more students because we're doing this online. So there's pros and cons to both of those things. And so at the end, what you'll see is that you'll see basically a reallocation of resources towards more digital activity. The things where this is happening the fastest is in retail in the United States. That was already going on, but it's really accelerated, and we see major retailers go bankrupt. You see the same thing, I think, in some Western European countries. And that has enormous consequences for jobs, because a large fraction of people who are employed in retail, a large part of the labor force is employed in retail, and if you need fewer people to fill stores, because there's fewer demand for it, this has effect on labor demand, but it also has effect and on the wages of these people. But it also has effect on commercial real estate prices and solvency of banks potentially. So these things are probably much more impactful than we initially realized. And so we think a lot about education, because I think a lot of us do stuff online, like lectures like this. But I think the biggest changes that you'll see is actually in commerce, where you really see a change in which products are being delivered to people. On top of that, you would expect in some sectors where you'd see a substantial demand drop. This is largely arts, entertainment, hotels, accommodations, and transportation. Those are the three sectors that are affected the most everywhere. In the short run, then the recession will trickle through to other sectors. But if you would have a substantial decline in labor demand in all of those sectors, you would also see a big change in wages. And because most of these people are already low-wage workers, you'd see, we were talking about the Gini coefficient, you would see also a substantial increase in inequality. So those are all not good things, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me ask the very last question, because we are almost out of time. Several students mentioned migration in their question, and let me ask a question by Maria Kotova. So migration is a big problem for Ukraine, and I don't know whether it might be a problem for the US, but it would be interesting to hear your opinion. So Maria asks, could you please comment on the potential effects of immigration influence on employment, and how this process, I think migration process, is going to change considering travel restrictions nowadays? And again, what it can be, what can you say about those restrictions, how they can affect wage dynamics in the future?
Yeah, so there's, I think this is also for a central bank important. It can also affect price dynamics. Let me tell you, I live here in Arizona. We are a state on the Mexican border. We make the news, even internationally, a lot with people who have very anti-immigrant stance. So that's not really the sentiment here in Arizona, actually. People are very pro-migration in many ways, because a lot of services are Mexican, provided by Mexican immigrants. The agricultural sector here on the border is all basically people who cross the border, work in agriculture here for the day, and then go back to Mexico. That's all cut off now, because these people, there's temporary visas. Some of them are actually still valid and they come, but not a lot. It's been reduced. Now that has, in fact, you'd think that that would actually increase the wages of local people, and it will in the longer run, but it's not a big effect. There's also not a huge labor supply in those areas of Americans who want to work in agriculture there. So those are really long run effects you would see in order to have that really have an effect on the local population. The short run, what it does is just makes production of agricultural products more expensive, and as a result will raise inflation rates. So that's kind of the shorter run concern. Now in Europe, there's a lot of cross-country migration, and so you would expect certain services, say, to also have that effect. And in fact, but my understanding I don't know the exact situation in the Ukraine. I think my understanding of the Netherlands is that there's also people who are stuck, who have migrated to the Netherlands, are living there, normally would go back and forth. There's a lot of Polish immigrants, but they can't, because now borders are closed. So there's other aspects to it. It's not only that people are prevented from migrating, a lot of it is back and forth migration that's being prevented. if borders remain closed, I think at the end, cutting off migration is generally not a good thing. What really happened, I think what we misunderstand is we tend to think of migration affecting everyone's wages in the same way, but you really want to think about migration tends to have a negative effect of workers who compete in the labor markets with migrants. If there's not a huge labor supply in those local labor supply in those labor markets, you probably don't see a huge effect on wages, and that's most of the evidence in the US, that it's very limited effect of migration on wages. What migrants do is they provide a set of services that are complementary for largely bought by people with higher incomes. And so they really, migration benefits people in the higher end of the income distribution more. And so it's there's really kind of two different effects on migration. And if you limit migration, you would have a lot less of that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for all the answers. We are done with the questions, but the last thing for us is to choose 3 best questions. So we had 6 questions. I can quickly remind you. The first question was about openness of economy. The second question was about wage regulation during crisis. Third question was about whether real wage growth affects inequality. Then the fourth question was about basic income. Fifth question was about digitalization and its impact on everything. And the final question was about migration.
Yeah, so let me say, I thought what I enjoyed, the question I enjoyed answering most was the one on universal basic income, because it reminds me of a discussion that we don't have very much here in the US. So I like that a lot. So thank you for asking that, because it's something that is more on the radar screen in Europe. And I think it's important for us also to think more about that here in the US in the terms that's being discussed in other countries, and it's just not. So thank you for asking that. I think wage subsidies is a great question, and there's a huge open discussion about it. So that's the second question that I would ask. And this is, we will have to continue to think about those things, because the nature of what we know about the nature of the COVID-19 recession and what's going to go going forward is really going to affect how we want to think about implementing labor market interventions by the government. And they're enormous at the moment. I mean, unprecedented. So asking that question and continuing to ask yourself that question when reality changes is very important. And I like the final question about migration, because it is just in a world where we are increasingly globalized, even though now there's come to a big halt, thinking through migration and its effect on wages and who benefits from it, but also how migration seeps through wages and prices is important for both the people's standards of living, but also important for monetary policymakers to think about.
No, thank you very much, Bart. Thank you very much for this great presentation, for very interesting topic, very relevant topics, for very good answers. Thank you everyone who joined us, who asked questions. Just final reminder that we have 2 days of conference on Thursday and on Friday. Please join us, and that's it for today. Thank you. Thank you. Bye. All the best.
Bye. Bye, everyone.